Hello, I'm Michael Brennan Dougherty of Business Insider, and I'm here on the second episode of Washington Squares with my friend Peter Suderman of Reason Magazine. How are you doing, Peter?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on your show, sir.
Oh, it's a pleasure. I also have the beautiful Business Insider office behind me, the light shining through, which Peter can't see, but you can. And I brought you on, Peter, because I've come to believe that video games are the new tentpole feature in our culture, the way that movies used to be. And I don't understand them. And there was a big game that came out this week called Mass Effect 3, and I want you to tell me about the place video games have in our culture and how we should view a release of a game now. Is it like the way we used to view the release of a movie?
No, I think movies are still movies.
Okay.
So I play a lot of video games. I watch a lot of movies. I'm a movie critic for the Washington Times. I think that movies, at least so far, still are movies are the new movies. Video games are something else entirely. They haven't displaced Hollywood. But they, I don't know if I want to say... I don't know if I want to say that they're ever going to displace Hollywood and Hollywood films, but I think what we are seeing happen is that... hang on.
No worries.
I have so many phones in this house.
That's okay.
What we are seeing happen is this... So let's just sort of look at popular narrative art forms over the last 100-something years. If you start with the novel and then you move to movies, and then you move to television, and you move to video games. That's sort of the progression, and you can maybe figure out a way to slot theater in there, and maybe you don't need television at all. But that's basically what the progression is. And with novels, people were experiencing other people's stories, primarily through text.
Right.
Exclusively through text. And what that did is that what's important about that is that it allowed it's not just it's not just the stories that were being told that mattered. It's also the medium that mattered, and that was people's primary way of experiencing the world at the time that novels dominated was through words and through text. And as you move into the middle of the 20th century, when visual mediums started to take over, the world became a much more visual place. But it was still a visual place that was controlled, where the visuals and sort of the narrative were controlled by someone else. And so Hollywood became very good at what are movies very good at? They're great at sort of visual spectacle, and they're also good at sort of showing conversations and interactions between people. But if you think about what people like you and I do all day long, and what increasingly lots of folks in the workforce do all day long, we don't exactly interact with people face to face. I mean, you think about what we're doing right now. We're talking to each other, but I'm looking, in fact, at my own face on my own screen.
Right, me too.
And I'm going to sit here, I'm going to sit at my desk all day today for 10 or 12 hours, and I'm going to watch Twitter and email, and I'm going to read the web, and I'm going to write stuff. And there's this, and so the way that we experience the world now is mediated through technology. And our experience of narrative and interaction in the world is a technology-mediated experience. And how do you tell stories like that you can't really tell stories like that in film, and it's even kind of hard in novels. And novels just sort of have lost their cultural currency. You talk to high school, artsy high school kids today. They're interested in computers a lot more than they are interested in novels, as a general rule. Obviously, many, many, many exceptions. And so, what I think the interesting and perhaps an important thing about video games is that they because you are playing a person and you are sort of experiencing things from that person's perspective, even if you're not actually, even if it's not actually a first-person game. Mass Effect is actually a third-person game, but you are sort of given, and you're allowed the opportunity to experience stories from this technology-mediated perspective in which there's all this information flashing up in front of you, in which you're controlling the direction that you want to go and sort of the shape that the narrative takes, or at least some of the small details. And so if I want to sort of offer a theory of why video games are relevant and why they matter right now, I think, and why they're maybe not overtaking movies, but why they are why they're becoming so dominant and why they are so important, then it starts with that idea, which is that movies and novels and television shows don't actually do a great job of showing the kinds of dramatic interactions and sort of and lived narratives that all of us are experiencing every day now. Sitting at computers and interacting primarily through technological mediation, and video games do an incredibly good job of that.
It's interesting because it's kind of a very. It sounds to me I'm an ex-video gamer. I think I played them, Nintendo when I was a kid, and then in college was the last time I really played video games, and the game I played was Counter-Strike, which was just the way I played it was I joined a server and I just shot other players and they shot me in like rapid succession.
But Counter-Strike is a team-based strategy game.
Right.
Did you ever have the experience of playing with a regular team, like a set of friends, and you would develop strategies and like learn how to run your path and shoot this guy at the right time and be in the right spot and sort of plan based on the other what you understood the other team to be doing?
Yeah, that's what we did, and I nearly failed out of school that semester because it was so addictive. And
same here, yeah.
And then I stopped playing video games. Now, it still is though a narrative. If it is a narrative form, and I grant that some of them are, it still is a team of creators who do. It is still a top-down experience. And I sort of think of it as like, the way you were describing it, I almost thought, okay, if I wanted to put a pin through this, I would say, oh, it's like a really complicated choose-your-own-adventure book.
So that's exactly what Mass Effect is, and I think I actually wrote something to that effect at one point about one of the Mass Effect about Mass Effect 2. I mean, it's totally a choose-your-own-adventure book. But Mass Effect is, well, highly nonlinear in a lot of ways. Mass Effect is much more sort of narratively driven, and I mean, it's basically a playable movie with a whole bunch of action sequences. And there are games like the Elder Scrolls series, like the Fallout series, that are even less linear and less driven by sort of single narrative lines.
Now, the question I want to ask is, we've had video games as part of the culture now for over 30 years in a big way. We've had video game criticism for about 20 years. Are video games... Yeah, I mean, criticism I mean by, like, rating. But, like, are video games art?
Yeah, totally.
Okay.
I mean, the answer to that question is definitely yes, but then you have to think about, okay, what kind of video games are you talking about? Are you talking about AAA blockbuster console titles like Modern Warfare, like Mass Effect, like these sort of the big basically male-dominated, male-driven, games. Are we talking about, because that's still a huge portion of the industry, and it's the stuff that makes the headlines. But you can also look at where's the big expansion in games in recent years. It's female players, it's older players, and they're not playing those type of games nearly as much. They're playing iPad games, iPhone games, things that you might classify as time wasters, things that you might classify, things like Farmville. Just totally games that are totally different from what this kind of thing that I play on consoles.
And there's this category of games now I'm seeing a lot of, like SingStar or whatever, that turn your PlayStation basically into a karaoke machine or something like that.
Are those games, or are those just sort of fun party experiences? I don't know. Do you call those games? That's
right. But I'm interested in these, in the what I almost want to call the tentpole games, the Mass Effect 3, or the ones I've seen kind of dimly are like often they involve like some kind of conspiracy theory that you're a part of or you're trying to unravel, and it does feel like a kind of, I guess I'd be willing to concede. I start off as someone who's kind of hostile to the idea of video games as art, but I definitely see a kind of pulp art aspect to this, like that's not that different from kind of old school detective novels or something like that, like in that category.
So if you're looking specifically at that category, I think the medium that it best, the best analogy is comic books, and in particular sort of genre-oriented superhero comic books, because you can because if you're going to cut out all of the other games, then you can cut out all of the non-superhero books, the Daniel Clowes memoirs and that sort of things. And within the genre of superhero comic books, there's great pop art. Is it timeless, stuff that people are going to be reading and like studying 1,000 years from now? I don't know, probably not. But Watchmen and The Dark Knight Returns, and and you can even look at more modern stuff. I'm a really big fan of Brian Vaughan's Ex Machina series. The Fables books, stuff where this is legitimate. I mean, it's certainly within that. There are comic books that certainly rise to the level of art of pretty much any HBO television show, of Mad Men, of that sort of thing, of very popular and accessible in a certain way, but also require a lot of patience, complicated storytelling. There's a lot of sort of symbolic storytelling, layers of meaning, great characters, all that stuff. But they're surrounded by a lot of pop crap, right? I mean, your typical superhero comic book is sort of a serviceable 15-minute diversion at best, just like your typical hour-long drama, half-hour comedy, and just like your typical blockbuster video game. Although blockbuster video games take you 5 or 10 or 15 hours to play rather than 15 minutes.
Now, when we say pop art, though, aren't we admitting, though, that video games or comic books? I'm trying to find out, is there a difference between what someone can get out of reading classic literature and what they're getting out of comic books and video games? Like, are we elevated by comic books and video games, or is that a different category? I mean, or have we overrated even novels and film as far as like their ability to elevate us, or to, by watching and digesting them, we become cultured individuals?
So, it's hard to answer this question quickly. We've known each other for a while, and I correct. Tell me if I'm wrong here, but I get the sense that you're at least much more open to, and sympathetic to the idea of a cultural hierarchy.
I am. But I'll say this, though, is that my first, grappling with ideas of assimilationism or separate but equal or group dynamics were from X-Men comic books. That's how I learned about Martin Luther King or Malcolm X. Essentially it was through the parallels that these comic book authors were clearly drawing. And I think like a lot of people in my generation felt exactly that same way now, reflecting on reading those. So maybe I was getting something out of it. I don't know.
I think it's absolutely true that there's nothing inherent in the medium of video games, and even if we can, limit that to these big tentpole, console blockbusters, there's nothing inherent in the medium of comic books or in the medium, of 2-hour, 3-act movies. There's nothing that says that they cannot be, that any of these things are, by definition, lesser. Or not valuable, or certainly it's true that a lot of these things will, that these things are meant as temporal, as ephemera. Comic books, for the most part, even if the writers are working in larger themes, they're really not written with the understanding that this is going to be a classic that stands the test of time. It's not that the writers are like, oh man, I'm writing throwaway trash, but that's not what they're thinking about. They are trying to figure out how to get you to fork over $3 for their, 22 pages, and how to get you to do it again next month. And that's what they want, and they'd like to tell a good story and that is memorable at the same time. And that's basically the same thing is true with video games and most television. I mean, it's actually a really weird thing in the last decade or so, the rise of the HBO model, the AMC model, where television creators are creating television that is understands itself to be serious and important. That is a new thing that did not exist until maybe not did not exist, but certainly did not exist in the sort of the strength that it does now, and really sort of didn't start popping up until the mid 1990s sometime.
Yeah, people are now used to it. They now expect that this show wants to deliver something, whereas previously there might be a mini series like Lonesome Dove or something like that people get really into and think is a great piece of work. But now it's like a planned seasonal show. Let's transition then to something maybe that's less meant to stand the test of time and is more trying to hit the time just right, which is HBO Film's Game Change, which is based loosely on a reported work about the 2008 campaign. And the movie focuses almost exclusively on the choice of Sarah Palin as John McCain's running mate. And you had a review of the film, and I watched some of it so far, and I'm familiar with the book, and I wanted to know what you thought.
So, I was not a big fan of the movie. It's kind of competently made, but it felt like watching dramatizations of a bunch of Politico stories. I mean, the whole thing was just so overt. All of the subtext was literalized in the dialogue. And the subtext, there wasn't even very much there. It was, oh no, we've made a terrible choice with Palin. And somebody will say, man, we really might have made a terrible choice with Palin. And, you've got John McCain explicitly talking about how mavericky he is and how he needs to make mavericky choices. And
isn't it all possible some of this is actually because they dramatize one phone conversation which is supposed to have been somewhat real, where someone kind of says to McCain, it's a high risk, high reward choice, and McCain replies, you shouldn't have told me that. I always like to take big risks. I mean, some of this, I think, even for a lot of politicians, sometimes we who make it our life work to like masticate on every single thing that they say. We say, "Oh, this is pablum." But I think even in real life, actually, some of the text really is text.
Sure, they've trained themselves to talk that way because they have to. And so it doesn't entirely surprise me that a bunch of, it's not totally wrong to have political consultants and politicians talking like political consultants and politicians do when they talk to reporters and when they're giving them quotes. But people don't just talk like that, and they don't exclusively talk like that, and their conversations do not have the sort of succinct flow of a little punchy news article, unless you're on television, unless you're on cable news, and that's what you're doing. And I mean, it's really telling that the movie uses so much cable news punditry to fill in the blanks of its story. I mean, there's, every couple of minutes, it seems like there's yet another montage of cable news pundits explaining what's going on, because it's just sort of a dramatic summary of some reported tidbits about the campaign's choice of Sarah Palin and how that played out. And
see, it's funny, when I've seen those narratives, I want to push back on that, because when I saw those montages, I thought, wow, this is actually, maybe inadvertently, and maybe it's a dramatic failure as a movie, but this actually is what happens. Like, the media plays such an outsized role in a presidential campaign. And so, it feels very meta, but it's like controlling the media, giving the media a story, the media getting into a frenzy. That was part of the 2008 campaign.
But if you think if this is a movie, it's not a campaign, and it's not a documentary, and it's not news story. So to what end? What the movie? This is the big problem with the movie, is that it reveals nothing. I mean, if you didn't follow the 2008 campaign, if you weren't reading the news, watching cable news, and reading the sort of daily horse race summaries, and if you haven't, if you didn't follow that, then this is a good summary for you. But it doesn't actually provide any. It doesn't provide any insight. It just sort of delivers some basic information about how the campaign went and problems that they had with Sarah Palin. There's no sort of relevance to it.
I mean, from what I've seen some dramatic failure in the movie too. So the beginning, and I don't think I'm spoiling much here. The beginning has this large setup of them trying to figure out how to save a campaign that's failing. They land on the idea of a game-changing nominee for vice president. Palin lines up with a bunch of qualities they're looking for, and there's this buildup of the advisors and McCain himself kind of falling in love with the idea of Sarah Palin. And then, hilariously, she's on the plane, and Steve Schmidt turns to her and says, "You're not," this is just after she's been chosen as a nominee, and he says, "You're not even fazed by this, are you?" And Julianne Moore turns her head and says, as creepy music starts to play, "It's God's plan." And, like, the creepy music picks up a bit. Schmidt gives this look of, like, oh, no. I mean, it was just so overwrought as drama. Although, I will say this.
But again, what does that tell us? All it tells us is something that we already knew, which was that the consultant class, and in particular McCain's consultant team, was a little bit creeped out by her overt religiosity.
Yeah.
Maybe more than a little bit.
I think of all the godless people I know, none are more godless than political consultants. I mean, it's just like, I'll just make that sweeping judgment as right here and right now.
I've got a big bucket of no comment for you on that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying they're bad people. or any worse than me. I'm just saying that, like, you know, these are like people whose job it is to like manage lies all the time and to see things in their
to
worst
shape
light.
Stories.
And to see things in their worst light all the time. And to literally make it their job to believe that what is real doesn't matter. Like, it's really funny. So yeah, and
Or to believe that there isn't anything real at all. I mean,
do you
that's
think,
sort of it's more fundamental than that.
do you think Game Change adequately, because in the beginning I felt like it was adequately dramatizing the legitimate excitement Sarah Palin seemed to bring to the campaign. You know, that, and it's a thing that seems like forgotten about or something from a million years ago or an illusion that was just had. And, you know, I thought it did dramatize that, although it cut it off very quickly. And as you say, I mean, the book.
Well,
and
it
the
did.
movie,
It came back to it at the end when, after the vice presidential debate, you know, Palin sort of, I'm going to say it, she went rogue. I can't believe those words just came out of my mouth, but you know, that's the language that's used in the film, and she becomes sort of the source of the campaign's energy towards the end of the second act, about 2/3, 3/4 of the way through the film, uses her prominence to sort of decide to do what she wants to do, says, look, I'm the one raising all this money for the campaign. You're going to listen to me, not the other way around. That's right. So it does come back, and it does make it clear that by the, as the campaign came to an end, she was as much, maybe more the focus than McCain was. I thought, I forget who wrote this. I believe maybe it was the reviewer in the Washington Post. But there was a critic who I was reading about the film said that one of the film's problems is actually one of the same problems that the campaign had, which is that it couldn't figure out how to make McCain a central character. And it's true for McCain campaign, true for the movie.
Yeah, how do we risk, I mean, this is a general question to kind of maybe bracket this. Do journalists risk making the consultant class the sort of unofficial historians of our politics now? Because those are who we talk to. Those are the people that talk the most and feed us the stories. And, what kind of bias would that bring to us now? I mean, we can't talk, and people didn't really talk. Historians can't talk to the kitchen cabinet of, a president from 80 years ago. But we do have this enormous, I almost said ginormous, consultant
It is
class.
ginormous.
Yeah. And I feel like that's the problem of Game Change. I think there's a lot of great journalism in Game Change, but I do feel like it makes canonical the view of the 2008 election from the consultant class.
Well, I would say that, let's see. One point I would make is that if you go and look at Ides of March, which is another big political movie that came out a couple of months ago and was based very loosely on the Dean campaign, it's another very consultant-centric film. And there is it's just increasingly understood that campaigns are run and managed and designed by consultants, and that they are in many ways the key players, certainly at the sort of staffer level. It's the consultants that matter almost as much, maybe more, than the candidates.
That's right.
In terms of the administration, and so that's not an inaccurate way, I think, to characterize modern campaigns. But the risk of letting them write history. Go back and look at the histories that are written of kings and rulers, in 1,500 years ago, and we get what we see are books and texts written by sort of the king's court and by the advisors, and that those end up becoming some of the most valuable sources because they're not just the king going, well, I'm basically God, and people do because they actually have real information, real information, distorted by all sorts of bias and personal stuff that we sometimes know about, sometimes don't, may never know about, but because they offer different perspectives and they offer sort of lower level perspectives versus the elevated sort of versus what you get when you're only talking to the principals and the principal players.
I feel like we're heading I feel like what we're driving towards is what I'd call the real end of history, which is when the consultant class and a bunch of 22-year-old kids can invent holographic politicians and literally program them. Because it's actually, I think, better to be the consultant than to be the politician. Because the politician can be responsible for the failure.
Well, you and I would certainly think that. I mean, just temperamentally, we're not. I don't think either of us are exactly built for running for office, but both of us are. We have an interest in sort of the mechanics of political administration, and that's what consultants do.
Maybe, yeah. I mean, I feel like I could maybe give the order to the Celtic hordes to attack the enemy. That would be like the other thing I could do in politics. But we don't have...
To take it back to our earlier discussion, comic books got there first.
That's right.
Frank Miller's Dark Knight sequel, the much maligned sequel to The Dark Knight Returns, actually included a holographic president controlled by one of the now at this point I even forget, by Lex Luthor, who had just sort of invented, and this was which was interesting coming after the original Dark Knight's use of Reagan as a foil.
Well, there's a perfect transition to the holographic presidential candidate known as Mitt Romney. And his holographic...
Maybe it's already happened!
Yeah, I know. This is right. This is right. That's why his campaign isn't so inspiring, because this is like a beta that's been put out. It's like they haven't worked it out yet. This is like the Windows 3.1 of presidential campaigns. And so Romney, I want you to talk a little bit about, and this will be more like almost an interview, about Romney's empty policy ideas. I mean, we've been told that there's 57 pages of this and detailed plans about that. But
59-point plan at the end of his 150-page PDF. So I wrote a column earlier this week titled something like Mitt Romney's Fake Policy Plans. And, if you look at his domestic policy, his economic domestic policy agenda, basically all of his of his large-scale plans lack some key structural thing. So if you look at his Medicare reform plan, he wants to put Medicare. He wants to do premium support while leaving a traditional government-run option in place. But he won't say what the size of the vouchers that he wants to give is, the premium support vouchers, and he won't say how fast he wants to let them grow. The whole point of Medicare premium support, one of the biggest points, I should say, the primary point is that you put Medicare on a budget by putting basically setting a per individual budget for Medicare. And then that becomes a sort of voucher, a premium support voucher for people. But if you don't decide what the size is and say how fast it will grow, then you have no idea what kind of savings you're going to produce. You look at his tax plan. He says, this tax plan is going to be revenue neutral, and I'm going to pay for it by cutting tax loopholes in the current system and by cutting spending. Well, he doesn't say what spending he's going to cut, and he doesn't identify most of the loopholes that he would like to get rid of. He also relies on dynamic effects that are, at very best, extremely difficult to believe. And so he's got this plan to change the tax code, but it doesn't tell you how he's going to pay for it all, even though he promises he's going to. And this, you look at the spending cuts part of that. It's especially it's especially fake given his plan to cut spending. You look at he's got a page, cut the spending, on his website, and he's done all these speeches where he stands up in front of a big banner that says "cut the spending." He talks about how he wants to get rid of government debt and reduce the size of government, cut $500 billion a year out of the federal budget. Well, on that page, on his cut to spending page, he identifies $320 billion in savings if you give him full credit for all of the savings that he identifies. But $60 billion of that is cut, waste, fraud, and abuse. Which waste, fraud, and abuse? I mean, out of the improper payments that we make. And it's true, we make $120 billion or something in improper payments each year, but if we knew how to how to dramatically reduce the amount of improper payments we make, we would have. It's not like the Obama
there's no line item that's waste, fraud, and abuse.
Right. Nobody knows where, how an easy way to do that. Romney is not suggesting that he's discovered some easy way to do that. No one, if it was something that we could do, it would be done already. He does the same sort of thing by saying we're going to save money by turning programs over to the states. Well, yes, according to the Congressional Budget Office, this block granting Medicaid would save about $28 billion a year. But Romney says he's going to save $100 billion a year from state innovation. Where's the other $70 billion coming from? I don't know. He doesn't know. And so you combine all of this, and he's promising so much that he, at the very least, is not saying how he'll deliver. And it becomes increasingly implausible and unlikely that he can deliver. And I'm not talking about just can politically. I'm talking about can on a sheer policy level. Could you actually come up with plans that work the way he says his are going to work? I doubt it. And then you have all the political barriers, which are going to make it totally impossible.
Of course. Now, are you the type of person that believes that you have to come out with an extremely, maybe strong policy agenda, clear principles, nail a few of the numbers, and then let the political process work backwards from that? So you set out the ideal, and then you make some compromises along the way, but as long as you all the cliches that Republicans use, bold colors, bold principles, etc. As long as you put that out there, you're moving the ball down the field, and maybe dragging everyone else with you.
So I think that the presidents are the chief. They're the most prominent policy leaders in the American political debate. They are presidential candidates are for a time sort of the front people for their party, even if they end up losing. They're the most prominent vehicles for the policies that their party stands for. And so what they need to be doing is not necessarily putting out 100-page wonky papers explaining every single little detail, in legislative ease. But what we need to see are workable frameworks that would work not just in and of themselves, but in conjunction with the other policies. And this is a big problem for Romney, is his policies, even if you could kind of figure out ways for his plans to work in and of themselves, they don't work together, because he's just calling for stuff that, if he is already having trouble identifying $320 billion in spending cuts to get to his $500 billion his $500 billion reduction that he says he's going to achieve, then you add the tax plan on top of that is going to cost additional money. According to Josh Barrow, it's something like $5 trillion over the next 10 years. Where are you going to, he's already failed to identify just the minimal spending cuts that he said he's going to make. And then he's not even coming close to identifying the additional spending cuts necessary for the other plans, much less figuring out how to raise the amount of money he needs to set a 4% of GDP defense spending floor, which is, another part of this. Nobody knows where this money is coming from. And so he's, saying at the same time that he's going to cut all this, cut all this wasteful stuff while spending even more money on defense and reversing Obama's Medicare cuts. And it doesn't work at all. And so what I think is that what I would like to see is for presidents to lay out workable frameworks, both for sort of individual areas, economic policy areas, and sort of for an economic policy plan as a whole, and see how it all works together. And you don't have to have every detail, and it's probably a bad idea to put in every single little detail.
Oh yeah, of course.
But it's got to be something that could plausibly work, and that you could make up a story about how it works.
Yeah, I mean, that goes back
with what Romney said.
Yeah, that goes back. I mean, I was my candidate boyfriend in this cycle was Jon Huntsman, and I thought he nailed.
You did so much good work for him. You really did. You really did. You should have been the Jon Huntsman consultant.
No comment. It just was one of those things where sometimes you're a journalist and you provide a counter narrative, and mine was that, secretly Jon Huntsman's really conservative, and not so secretly, because you just have to look at what he did in Utah,
right,
and then look at what he's proposing as policy. And anyway, and then it kind of fell to me to explain all that. And I thought he did exactly kind of what you're talking about, which is putting out a big framework. And his big framework on taxes was, okay, we're going to have these 3 tax rates, and then we're going to eliminate every market distorting deduction or tax credit from the code. And the math works out. It's revenue neutral. And then we just have to cut spending to get back towards revenue. And too big to fail banks. Here are some big policy framework ideas for getting rid of the sort of implicit bailout that the top 6 or 5 banks have in this country. And they were simple, exciting. They weren't 159 pages long, although there was some meat to get into. It's not political, though, in the sense that's not the stuff you get elected on.
Yeah, but Jon Huntsman did not even attempt to run on his policy. I mean,
nope.
You mention it every now and then in a couple of op-eds, but Jon Huntsman ran on this weird reverse culture war campaign in which, he was sort of scolding the Republican base. And not that I think that he would have, that there's some great chance that he would have succeeded and had he run on a much more policy-oriented platform, but he would have had a better chance. There were a lot of conservatives who at the time, and especially now, look at the guy and say, just on a pure policy level, he was the best, and he could have pleased a lot of conservatives that way. But he didn't even make an attempt, and so we don't. Again, I don't think that it's particularly likely that if he had run on a sheer policy message that he would have won, but he would have had a better shot than taking the route that he did, which was to differentiate himself from Mitt Romney by telling Republicans how stupid they were.
Yeah, I mean, I would just, it's funny. I saw an interview he just did with Grist, and they just kept grilling him about climate change.
Right.
And it was pretty funny because he had indicated he'd said the cultural thing that I agree with scientists on climate change. And then everyone took that as an admission that he wanted some grand policy solution to climate change along the lines that, and some of the solutions that some scientists promote are really radical. They're basically like destroy industrialism, if you can create a shorthand for it. And he never embraced that. Then he went to the Heritage Institute, was interviewed there about what he thought, and he said, well, I don't think there's a policy solution to this, but I just trust the authority of science on scientific questions. And then there's a different mode for political decision-making. But somehow this has been turned
Jim
into
Mancy has been saying for years. in a little more with a little more nuance, but that's basically the
exactly. And it's been turned into this gigantic flip flop, and I don't even know if Huntsman is extremely clear on the distinctions he's groping at there, although he's making the right ones, and but that's not the 2012 era Republican Party. That's not where we're at.
He's pretty constrained if he and just politically for better or for worse. I have I'll just for better or for worse, Huntsman, no Republican candidate for president anyway is going to get anywhere if they're calling for a carbon tax or a big cap and trade scheme as part of their current, sort of as their agenda for what they want to do in the White House. Not in 2012, maybe some other year, but that's just not it's just not going to happen. And so any candidate who's smart enough to run a real national campaign is going to know that.
Now, I want to ask you one final question going back to Romney and about what America needs or what the Republican Party needs. My view is that Romney's got this nomination locked up and we're just pretending he doesn't. And Romney as the Republican nominee, you wrote a big feature for Reason, and I want to ask you, does the United States need a consultant-in-chief?
What does the United States need? I'm not sure. I'm quite prepared to lay out my plan for America today.
Right.
But there's I think it would be an interesting experiment to have a rigorous, business-minded, efficiency expert in, running things and being the decision maker in the White House. That is in no way an endorsement of Romney or of anyone in particular, but it's not something that we have seen in recent political history. The presidents the presidents have been politicians, have been lawyer types, have not been folks who had considerable experience, decades making decisions about how to make business ultra efficient, right. And especially from a sort of modern, sort of Reagan era perspective, in the ultra rapid creative destruction that has sprung up and become part of the economy of the American economy in the last 20 or 30 years. That perspective has not been particularly well represented in the White House, either in the presidency or in the ranks of top top cabinet, top advisor types. And so, it would at least be an interesting experiment and an interesting story to see how that played out.
I'm willing to agree with you, and I don't care for Romney at all, and I don't care for the Republican Party in particular, and democracy generally. However, I'll still express opinions on the election. And there's something about Romney that is appealing. I saw him in Nashua speaking to a Chamber of Commerce. And he made some kind of gaffe there that I missed, even though it was right in front of me. And it became a national story that night. But everyone in the room was eating out of his hand. And these are not my people, Chamber of Commerce types.
Right.
But he was like the king of Chamber of Commerce people. Like, he was like what every one of them would have dreamed they could be,
Right.
And he was great and super competent and, almost inspirational in a weird way. It was kind of like going to a really...
That's his world, totally.
It was like going to an uplifting church in a religion that you don't believe in. Like, that was my experience at this place. And I'm curious. I'm curious also if this isn't the new model for what our future presidents, where they will come from. You know, as you said, they used to be lawyers, career politicians, maybe even generals. And I think the Western form of government, which is this mixture of public supremacy and private sector creativity and wealth generation, you know, I feel like consultant class people are you know, we were talking before about political consultants inventing a politician. Maybe the consultants are the new pool from which we will draw our politicians naturally. When your entire civilization is a kind of like public-private partnership that just needs constant manipulation and massaging and repackaging to make people believe in it, even when it's not delivering the results we want. I feel like that's naturally not going to draw trial lawyers. It's going to draw people that were in P&E or people that negotiated deals to build a sports stadium or, you know, whatever. People that save the Olympics. So I feel like Romney is this test case. And also, Romney says horrible things, in my view, on foreign policy, and yet part of me suspects he's lying about them. That he's just like saying this to appease the base. And maybe this is a hope I should not have, but my hope is if Romney does become president, that he's somehow impervious to the kind of messianic qualities that have been in Bush and in Obama, as far as like providing meaning to America or providing some kind of value to our foreign policy. And I mean values in the sense of ideals. And, you know, I hope he looks at it like a realist would, which is, you know, foreign policy, here's a cost-benefit analysis. The risks are way too high. We're not going to intervene in this country's internal affairs. Boom. Next decision. You know, we've got a duplicative government agency. Boom. Get rid of it. I would love that, actually. I think it's the best someone like me could hope for.
It certainly sounds like an improvement.
It does. I would like politics to operate. I don't think this is possible in a democracy, maybe, because everyone thinks that somehow the meaning of America is at stake and the meaning of my position in it is at stake in every political fight. But I would like it if our politics operated on a level that was further down from Mount Olympus and more like a Chamber of Commerce meeting. Quotidian, maybe sometimes backslapping, but not like Bush's second inaugural where we're talking about lighting a fire in the minds of men across the entire planet. So the Chamber of Commerce may not be my people, but they're better than the world changers. So on that, we should probably wrap it up. This has been fascinating, enlightening, and fun. And
Indeed.
I'll have you on again very soon, Peter.
Awesome. Looking forward to it. Nice to talk to you.
All right. Take care.
Bye, Michael.
Bye.